Bonjour à tous. My name is Graham Fox, and I'm the president of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you for this final installment in the Policy Options Pre-Election Breakfast Series. D'entrée de jeu, je tiens à souligner que les terres sur lesquelles nous sommes rassemblés aujourd'hui font partie du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe-Algonquin. Et c'est dans un esprit de destin commun que nous nous réunissons ici ce matin. In designing this series, and many of you have been with us from the first event in late January, Policy Options Editor-in-Chief Jennifer Ditchburn deliberately set out to buck the trend. Right from the get-go, our working title for this series at the office was the Not the Horse Race Breakfast. Our aim was putting on this series was to provide opportunities for everyone interested in public policy to have discussions on complex and important issues, but without engaging in the politics of them. What Policy Options does on its platform every day, we wanted to bring to a live event, provide an opportunity for substantive conversation on key policy issues. And I want to take this opportunity to congratulate Jennifer for her nomination for Best Column of the Digital Publishing Awards this year. It is absolutely wonderful to see the outstanding work that she does every day be recognized in such a way. Tout au long de cette série, on a discuté de politique fiscale, de changement climatique et des relations couronnes autochtones. Aujourd'hui, nous allons discuter de la désinformation et de l'intégrité du processus électoral. Ce que nous n'avons pas fait, par contre, c'est d'en parler en termes d'impact sur les sondages ou des fortunes des partis et de leurs chefs. This morning's topic is probably the ideal way to end this breakfast series. After spending time on important issues that we can hope will be debated during the campaign, we will focus this morning on the system itself. What are the risks to the integrity of the electoral system? And what are we doing to protect our democratic process from outside influence and fake news? Pour l'événement d'aujourd'hui, il nous fait plaisir d'avoir le soutien de CBC Radio-Canada ainsi que de Microsoft Canada qui ont généreusement appuyé l'événement. Thank you to CBC Radio-Canada and Microsoft Canada for their support. And we're also very fortunate to have the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University as a partner for this breakfast series. Alors, un grand merci à vous également. So, do enjoy your breakfast, and without further ado, I'll invite Jennifer to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. I wanted to say a special hello to the people from the forum, the Future Forum at the Institute on Governance, who are exchanging a breakfast with us, so welcome. Thank you for coming. So I'll briefly introduce our panel, and if you want to read their full, massive bios, you can look at our website. Elizabeth Dubois is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and a member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa. Taylor Owen is the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications and associate professor in the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. And Jennifer McGuire is the general manager and editor-in-chief of CBC News. Let's give them a nice welcome. So as usual, we'll have time towards the end for questions and answers. So please don't be shy about putting a tough question to our panel. They can take it. So I thought I'd start with a broad question, and then we'll get a little bit more specific and then go broad again towards the end. So for each of you, and Elizabeth, I'll start with you, we hear a lot about threats to democracy, threats to our electoral process, basically on a daily basis now. This is big news every day. If you had to pick out one concern that you think people should legitimately be worried about, what would that be?
You know, we were told what the question was going to be beforehand, and I still am having trouble really deciding. More than one, all of them. No, so I think the biggest thing, and it's something that underpins a lot of the conversations we're having, a lot of the fears that are out there, is that we have a set of rules and regulations and norms that were designed for a media system that doesn't exist anymore. They were designed for a media system that was primarily broadcast, that required you to have a lot of access to resources to be able to create political content that was going to reach a wide number of people. And that context is very different from today, where people have access to wide audiences, to niche audiences, where you can access those audiences whether you have a lot of resources or a little resources, and where we have ways of separating the creation of the content from the dissemination of the content, right? You can post on Facebook, somebody else can go and choose to disseminate it widely. It might not even be your choice. And I think that this difference in the media system is the thing that underpins a lot of the worries around disinformation, around how political advertising is going to work in this election, around how digital literacy and media literacy needs to be updated because we just don't have the skills among our population to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And is your concern rooted in the fact that we haven't figured out how to manage it, or that we don't understand it, how things have changed? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that there are some people who sort of intuitively are starting to understand it, particularly younger generations know how to exist in this media system because it's all they've ever known, but they aren't articulating it in a way that connects with the people who are currently in policymaking roles. And so there's a disconnect there.
And we could have a whole discussion about bringing those kinds of people into the public service, which is not always easy, right? Taylor.
Yeah, I worry about a lot of things. So choosing one is a challenge. But most of my concern is grounded in what we've seen from other elections around the world since this problem really came on the radar in 2016. In every democratic election we've seen since then, we've seen widespread corruption of information in the public sphere, both from domestic actors and international actors, from lack of a regulatory framework, as Elizabeth said, to deal with this kind of information and regulate it in an election, which is the time when we put this real value on overseeing what is allowed to be said and what isn't. Mm-hmm. So that really concerns me. But I think the broader issue isn't just about elections. It's about what's happening in our public sphere. Mm-hmm. And that is what really worries me. I think we're seeing almost what I would call an epistemological crisis, where we no longer know what reliable information is in our society. And I think that's a democratic problem, not an election integrity problem, that we don't have access to a common set of understandings about our society. And if we don't have that, I'm not sure how we can make collective decisions together, including elections. So my broader, deeper issue is that we are seeing a crisis of information in our society.
That you did go broad. Jennifer.
I'd like to pick up on a little bit of what Taylor says, because we're seeing disinformation campaigns not only around politics, we're seeing it around vaccines, around other issues. And I think the thing that disturbs me the most is the propensity for the public to believe fake news. There have been several studies that I've seen lately that show the propensity is to believe, and I think that this year we've spent a lot of time talking about how we engage as a news organization in media literacy, and what is our obligation in terms of delineating what we do from some of the other content that you see out there, and is there more we should be doing to not only explain what is a fact, but how we decide it's a fact, and being much more transparent about that. And I think the media, has a bit of an ego, and because we say it, you should believe it. But that is not the environment anymore, and I think it's inherent on us to do a better job of that. And we're looking at various things. CBC is exploring technological fingerprinting, so you can sort of receive our content and tell that it's legitimate. But I think there's more to do around labeling and on how we write and how we unpack journalism to help distinguish what we do. But my big concern is around the propensity to believe and the volume of information. The other point I will make is we see more and more this idea of sort of information bubbles, where people's personalization of technology is serving up sort of interests. So you're going to content that affirms your point of view, and so this idea of collectivity and tolerance of other points of view is also something that concerns me a lot. And we don't control all of that. And what is our role in making sure that we're promoting tolerance in the context of how people consume information?
Thank you. So I wanted to go now a little bit more specific. Obviously, platform technologies is evolving and has an impact on our democratic process. So let's go through some of the things that we hear about. Elizabeth, what are bots and how are bots being used in our political system and our information system?
Yeah, so political bots are automated agents that we find on social media and potentially on other kinds of online platforms. They are often created in order to mimic human behavior. And so that could be human behavior as in retweeting something, liking, favoriting, or creating their own content that sounds like it comes from a human, but actually it was a program that was designed to then spread that information. These political bots can be used for really good purposes and for some questionable purposes. The kinds of bots we hear most about in the news, I think, are the Russian bots, right? The ones that were amplifying these voter suppression messages or messages that were exacerbating existing political divides and potentially polarizing conversations in the U.S. context. That kind of amplification role is one of the things that these automated accounts can do. But they can also do things like dampen conversations. So they can use a hashtag that's being used to organize and mobilize people, and they can flood it with nonsense, and so the hashtag's not a helpful tool for organization anymore. Or they might be bots that are created to send a whole lot of hate speech and then push particular voices out of the online conversations altogether. On the other hand, we have bots that news organizations use to make sure the same article gets posted immediately on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and the website. And those kinds of bots are really great and wonderful. Mm-hmm. And so we've got the core idea of a bot is that it's this automated agent, and then it gets used in a bunch of different ways.
So how does a bot differ from a troll?
This is one of the most difficult problems because as bot detection has gotten better, as Twitter, for example, has started to say we want to reduce the number of bots that are interacting in political spaces nefariously, bot creators get better and better at masking themselves. And one of the best ways to mask a bot is to sometimes have human interaction, genuine humans typing things out on that same account. And so then the account kind of becomes a cyborg. And then it's harder to identify whether it's an automated account or it's a human. Because a troll we usually think of as a human who is running with a particular account. Sometimes it's anonymous, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes they're doing it for political reasons, sometimes they're doing it for the lols, right? It's an account that is trying to stir up and create this kind of emotional tension and disagreement. And so the human versus non-human distinction becomes really tricky.
Mm-hmm. Taylor, what about predictive analytics and algorithms? How are they being used in our political system, and by whom?
That's a big question. I mean, the core things that algorithms do in the information space right now is filter the content that we see. So if you think about Facebook, for example, there are about 1 billion new pieces of content to Facebook every day. We as an individual are obviously not going to see all 1 billion pieces of that content. What the average user of Facebook has is a universe of about 10,000 pieces of content that they might see at any one day. These are all the content posted by the friends we might have, the people who have purchased access to our feed, the pages we follow, the content they're producing, right? And so someone or something has to decide which approximately 50 pieces of content out of that universe of 10,000, out of the bigger universe of 1 billion a day, we personally are going to see. And that algorithm is built and designed in a certain way to give us a certain type of content and to evaluate how we engage with that content. And it is built by a private company who wants us to engage more. So the primary way that algorithms function to decide what we see is, well, I should caveat that. We don't really know because the algorithm's secret, right? Which is part of the problem that we'll get to. But we know to a certain degree that it has been highly torqued towards engagement. to keep us on the site for longer and to force and to incentivize us to engage with it, whether it's sharing or liking or reposting or retweeting, whatever it might be. And it turns out that engagement isn't necessarily 100% overlapped with quality information and healthy engagement in the public sphere, right?
Okay,
in fact, it's often the opposite, right? Like a hate comment, you're more likely to comment on something that you hate than something you like, for example, right? Or the extremes elicit this kind of engagement. So that's one way that algorithms work. The other way, which you mentioned, you bucketed two in one, so I can answer this.
Yes.
But that's the algorithmic piece. The psychographic profiling, or the profiling piece, really refers to the way our attention can be purchased. So the engagement is the kind of organic way content flows based on this algorithmic decision making. The other way to get our attention on these platforms is literally to buy it. And that's where the profiling comes in and the micro-targeting comes in, where a set of tools have been provided to anyone who wants to influence our attention. Advertisers, political parties, foreign governments, activist organizations, anyone who wants to influence our behavior can do so via these sets of tools that allow us to be micro-targeted. And what that means is that using these vast stores of data and these very detailed profiles that companies have of our likes, our behaviors, what they infer about us, often in the thousands and thousands of variables, target content can be designed to nudge our behavior. And that is a very powerful tool.
And where is the danger there for us as citizens when people can tailor that information to us?
So there's many. I mean, Jennifer had a great line about I can't remember what you said exactly, but it was about our perception of truths and our ability to perceive and evaluate facts. And that was very easy in a world. It was quite binary, right? Like it was like blatantly false information in the tabloids or true information in the media. Mm-hmm. Everything now exists in this very much more muddled gray zone. And content can be targeted to us that plays on our very specific vulnerabilities. And it might not be blatantly false. It's just designed to slightly nudge our behavior. Our behavior to go purchase something. Our behavior to not vote. Our behavior to dislike a candidate. So I think it's dangerous because, well, one, it's not transparent. Nobody knows who's being targeted with what. But it also is just this very sophisticated tool that is literally designed to shape our behavior. And I don't think we've seen that before.
And I was just going to add, in this space, everything is framed and designed to look like news. So sponsored content often is presented as a news story. It's a commercial interest that's deciding that they do the story and the point of view that they're taking. So we're also seeing a disturbing trend lately is more appropriation of content. So I now have a takedown unit in my newsroom that spends time looking on social media to see our brand or our stories torqued in some way and reframed as something more disturbing. So a reel, for instance, our stories, a real story covering Christchurch, had a headline replaced under a CBC News brand with a racist headline. So we have to be vigilant in terms of protecting the brand because that also erodes trust in terms of credible news organizations.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask Taylor and Elizabeth, how has all of this changed political advertising? We've talked a little bit about some of the tools. So how are political parties or actors using these tools?
Yeah, so political actors, which I would say includes both political parties and third parties, are, I think, usefully innovating in their communication approaches, right? We had, in the last election, the big conversation that I tended to be part of was voter apathy and young people not going to be engaged and political parties not trying to engage with the young people because they don't think their vote matters. And now we're seeing really interesting, innovative uses of technology in ways that, at least on the surface, are directed to try and engage more people, a more diverse kind of voter in the electoral process. And so on the one hand, we could look at things like predictive analytics and say, well, if most people, on average, people don't have time or inclination to engage in political information gathering themselves to the extent that everyone in this room does, right, then targeted advertising could be really helpful. It could be a really great way to make sure that the voter has enough information to make the decisions that they need to make on election day. It also means that political parties are spending more time thinking about what data do I need to connect with this person rather than how do I get this person in a room. And so those kinds of interactions that you optimize for might lead to very different types of engagement, very different types of voters, right? Informed can be measured in a bunch of ways. Informed could be, did you get this information delivered to you? Or informed could be, did you get invited into a community of people who are discussing these kinds of issues? And so I think that what we end up seeing is political advertising that, at least at this point, is geared more towards let's just get some information to some eyeballs and less of the build a community from this. On the flip side of things, we also have political advertising that is less transparent than it was before because there is so much use of social media and search and other online tools to deliver political information. We have less ability to keep track of it all. So the new registry that's been put forward through C76 is one step towards building out more transparency, but it's really only skimming the surface.
Jennifer, how do journalists cover all of these things? I remember years ago when I was still covering elections that the assignment was to find candidate gaffes on social media or interesting things that candidates said or leaders said on Twitter or on Facebook.
They still exist.
They still exist. We cannot stop having candidate gaffes. But how all these things that we're hearing about, how do journalists, and no, also we didn't mention this, but also there are areas that are kind of black boxes, right? Like WhatsApp and WeChat and other areas that are very hard to monitor.
I mean, certainly the environment is really complex, and we can't put the obligation all on journalists. There are other players in the sphere, and I think that's an important thing to mention. But I will say there are things that we're doing. So, for example, we are partnering with Taylor and other organizations to do a better job of understanding where information comes from and identifying things that are campaigns from bots or from, essentially identifying the source of the information and doing that in a much more aggressive way. We've just launched a verification unit, which will be active from now through the election campaign. I'm staffing it, which, sounds like something, well, of course, but in shrinking newsrooms, it's a big ask to create a fairly robust content unit to just do this kind of work. And we're doing more around transparency and educating the public about what we do and how we do it differently. And we're not only doing it to traditional news audiences. So I'm actually a big believer in technology. We've been an early adopter at CBC News, and we were the first Snapchat channel which launched this fall. And that's targeting younger Canadians, but we gave that channel a beat, a media literacy beat. So in addition to the kind of things you'd expect a 14-year-old to be interested in, we're starting to educate them about media and what is, how to be critical thinkers in terms of where their information comes from. And there's more to do in that space as well. And then just really being aggressive in terms of journalism, right? And identifying what is real, what is not, making sure we're not getting caught up in amplifying things that are sponsored or campaigns driven by other sources. And we're going to play in the idea of interactivity in a different kind of way, and that is engaging audiences. So, the other thing we haven't talked a lot about, but we're seeing more polarization, and that is these affirmation bubbles where people only care about the things they already believe, which I think is a real risk. So we'll have teams of our social teams who will actually interact with the public in a live way through SMS, answering questions and trying to refer people to other information, and then making sure in how we curate we're representing a diverse point of view in terms of our own referrals, so we're not doing the same thing inadvertently.
So you touched on this. media manipulation. And I just wanted to read you a quote from a recent report to the EU. It said, the UK pro-Leave Brexit campaign, the right-wing Alternative for Germany party, the Front National in France, most recently the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, all demonstrate how the mainstream digital media ecosystem has rewarded polarizing, controversial, and even radical voices with excessive attention and oxygen to inflate their ideas. So how does a media organization, and there's been a lot of criticism in the United States from New York Times, Washington Post, amplifying far-right voices. How do you avoid that? And how do you say don't cover this or tamp it down? That must be a hard decision.
Yeah, I mean, we tell our newsrooms, it's less about being first and it's more about being considered in terms of that propensity to sort of get it in and turn it out. And I do think it's our obligation to cover what are social trends in this country, but how do you do it, right? And how do you do it in a considered way? So it's complex, but I think it comes back to being really deliberate about journalism and where you're positioning your view, and then much more transparency on the journalist's part with the audience about why we come to the conclusions that we do. I mean, we know still in Canada, the Edelman Trust study shows that there's still trust in media in Canada. We're not seeing the same kinds of erosions we're seeing in other places. But on the flip, we are seeing the propensity for people to believe things that are not true. And so that's a risk.
There's a great report from a U.S. research organization called Data and Society called The Oxygen of Amplification, which gets at this phenomena, that one of the real challenges is the interplay between the social ecosystem and the mainstream news ecosystem, and how they feed off each other.
That's
right? And the mainstream news organization being not just the public broadcasters and the New York Timeses of the world, but also the new cable organizations and the fragmented legacy outlets as well. And one of the real challenges we've seen is these fringe ideas gaining legitimacy in audience because they get absorbed and reported inside this broadcast ecosystem. And so we need to think really carefully about what that transmission mechanism is. When something gets reported on, is it one crazy person saying something online? Is that deserving of placement in an evening news? And does that then legitimize that voice or that idea or that political party or that, right? So I think there's some real challenges there.
Well, just to follow up on that, I think there's been a lot of research in the U.S. on the role of Fox News in the media ecosystem in amplifying even disinformation with impunity, not apologizing for it. So it's the fact that we have a very different media ecosystem in our favor, do you think, in terms of the safety of our democratic system? We don't have a Fox News. We don't have, I don't think that the Rebel has achieved the size of Breitbart and so on yet. But
I think some of the same phenomena are in play, but we do have a very different media ecosystem. There's no question. We did a survey recently where we looked at people's trust levels for media organizations in Canada and found across the political spectrum, so 5 segments of ideological clusters from far right to far left, all of them had over 80% trust levels for the 5 main media organizations in the country, from the National Post to the CBC to the Toronto Star, across the spectrum, right? And so that would look very different in the United States. You'd get much levels of... So we do have a different baseline. But one of the problems with this whole conversation is that we actually don't know very much about how information flows in Canadian society. And so the project that Jennifer was mentioning is this monitoring project that we're partnering with the Public Policy Forum on, which is really just to, in this election, get a sense of what is flowing, who is consuming what, how are media organizations covering it and amplifying it. And until we do that, these conversations are really difficult because, as you mentioned, we're using research from other countries to base our analysis of our own. And that's
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, so I wanted to. You mentioned we have a different media system. We've got the kind of ones in Canada that people have a whole lot of trust in, regardless of what part of the political spectrum they're coming from. There was a study done in the U.S., and even in the U.S. population, there's way more agreement than public discourse would have us believe, right? I think a lot of the fears of this polarization has not been substantiated. We don't have evidence to say that, particularly in Canada, and even to a certain extent in the U.S., that it is as bad as we fear, right? That doesn't mean we should ignore it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to the polarizing effects that might be there. But it does mean that we need to kind of make sure we don't let ourselves run away with this fear of polarization without first doing this work, Taylor, that you're talking about, of actually understanding how information is flowing through this system, actually understanding what people's everyday habits are when they engage with political information. When we look at people who are politically engaged, people who really care a lot about news and being informed about politics, even when they are very steadfast in their beliefs, they have incentive to go and see what the other side is saying so that they can make their arguments better, so that they can know what might be coming. And so of the cohort who are the most engaged, we actually tend to see that those people are pretty media literate, pretty savvy, will go and pull in information from a bunch of different places because they care a lot. I think the bigger worry is the people who do not self-select into politics, the people who are only going to encounter incidentally information through Facebook or Twitter or conversations with their one really engaged political friend. It's those people who are not themselves trying to make use of this very diverse media system. Those are maybe the people that are most likely to be problematic in terms of the strength of our democracy. They're also the least likely to create bots to go and influence and manipulate public opinion. So I think not only do we need more evidence about polarization, I think when we think about the mechanisms of how this information develops and who it gets sent out to and in what ways, the people who are at most risk of being polarized are the least likely to be the ones doing the polarizing effects.
They're also the majority, though, by far.
The ones who don't care?
Right.
Yes.
So your group we should be concerned about is like 95% of the population.
Unlike the people in this room. Yeah. So one of the threats that we talk a lot about these days is that of foreign threats, which has been very well documented, as you all know, around the 2016 American presidential election and the activities of Russia's Internet Research Agency. I'll just quote you from Oxford's Computational Propaganda Project. They said over 30 million users between 2015 and 2017 shared the IRA's Facebook and Instagram posts with their friends and family. 30 million users. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has said it's very likely Canadian voters will encounter some form of foreign cyber interference related to the 2019 federal election. Elizabeth, how worried should we be about this, and who are we worrying about? Is it just Russia? Are there other foreign actors?
It's very likely not just Russia. I think that China, a number of countries in the Middle East, and then a bunch of people in countries that we would maybe not suspect as much, something like people from the U.S., right? The U.S. has an election coming up, another Democratic election in a similar English-speaking, primarily population. Good place to test out your tactics. And so I think we should be worried about foreign interference. I think the CSE report made that very clear. Focusing solely on Russia, as largely we have been in the last few years, I think is very problematic, and we need to be thinking more broadly about that. I also think we need to be thinking domestically. I think there's a big role for third parties to play in our democratic system, but we don't have a good way of keeping track of what those third parties are doing and making sure that that is in line with what we think Canadian democracy should look like. And so I see a lot of gray areas that could be exploited in the upcoming election.
And Taylor, just to speak about the foreign threats and we'll talk about the domestic ones, what are those foreign actors trying to do exactly?
I mean, we don't have a very clear sense of that. I mean, certainly in the case of the Russian example in the U.S. election and their interventions in subsequent elections, it's been to destabilize the legitimacy of elections and divide citizens against each other during elections, right? So in the case of the Chinese government in Canada, one can imagine a wide range of influences they might want to have on the election, whether it's to defeat a leader or to promote a certain policy idea. But it can be really difficult to see. I mean, the Chinese government, the example of the Chinese potential intervention in Canada is a really good example of this. In Vancouver, where I live, a large proportion of the mainland Chinese community gets their news through WeChat. And WeChat is filled with misinformation about Canadian politics.
What WeChat is for
WeChat is sort of like Facebook, Twitter, everything combined into one. Run in China and used by mainland Chinese around the world. Okay. And it folds all of these capacities into one stream of content. And it's very difficult to see because it's a lot of it's in groups, like WhatsApp functions. But there is a ton of misinformation about Trudeau, about Canadian policy, about local elections, about local candidates flowing through that system. That's a very difficult thing to see. Mm-hmm. One more example of how hard this is to get at that I find really illustrative is one of the things we now know the Russian government did in the 2016 election is set up Facebook groups for popular figures in the African American community. So they did one for Beyonce, they did one for Malcolm X, a year before the election. And for almost a year, all they did was post fan content of those figures. 2 days before the election, they built up a huge audience of largely African-American followers of those pages. And 2 days before the election, they started posting content designed to suppress the African-American vote. And the thing they had tested through that micro-targeting mechanism I mentioned that worked was information about Bill Clinton's welfare reform initiatives that disproportionately affected the African-American community. So 2 days before, in swing states, they blasted the audience of those pages with that information. Now, how do you see that?
It's very sophisticated
thinking. It's really thinking, and it's strategic, but it's a very difficult thing to spot because it's literally using the functions of these tools to this end. So I think there's going to be lots of reasons people want to intervene, and to Elizabeth's point, it's not just going to be governments, it's going to be activists and companies and anyone who wants to influence what we think and how we behave. But the mechanisms are very difficult to get at.
So one of the things that all these actors are trying to do, one of the tools that they're using is disinformation. I use that word instead of fake news because fake news has been used in other ways to attack journalists. But I'll tell you the definition that the European Union has used for disinformation. Quote, verifiably false or misleading information that is created, presented, and disseminated for economic gain or to intentionally deceive the public and may cause public harm. So it's clear that this kind of information is being used to fire up people or to divide them. Jennifer, from your vantage point, how are you seeing this unfold?
We're seeing more trolling of our journalists, for sure. We're seeing more polarization in terms of reaction to stories. We're seeing campaigns, for sure, and not just in politics. You know, I mentioned vaccinations. That's another one that we're seeing a lot of activity around. And we're doing more to understand what is driven by these campaigns, working with partners like Taylor, making sure that we're going to the experts to help us understand what's happening out there and then what we do about it in terms of educating the public, in terms of what's real. But it's huge, and people have to understand the context that newsrooms are not equipped to be the sole people to be able to sort of turn it around and help the public understand all the implications of this.
And I think you made reference to this before, but that your journalists have been under threat as well?
Yes, we're seeing, and in fact, we saw it a little bit in the Alberta campaign, and certainly journalists covering the election have real concerns about safety. And we've expanded. We do risk training for our journalists, more for sort of high-risk foreign deployments, but we're now doing it for domestic deployments. So some of that is, people going into crowd such situations, and some of the situations you've seen about journalists being ambushed as they're doing live shots on camera, but also we're seeing much more cyber attacking of our journalists. We've actually changed our journalism policies to allow our journalists to mute some harassment that they're getting on social media, but we're training them how to deal with it for sure.
So, going back to the threats, and you mentioned domestic threats, who would we be looking at? Who would, in terms of people that might be trying to thwart the process or influence the process that might not be from Russia or China or Iran?
So we could take that case of the Facebook groups that were created for a completely different purpose and then right before the election switched. You could imagine that happening with any number of Canadian-based Facebook groups, or you could imagine it happening with a WhatsApp group or a mailing list that somebody has created. That could be an established organization. It could be from an individual who works really hard to collect up an audience, and then they could switch. And that might be legitimate political speech. That might be a completely fair use of your access to the Canadian population, because maybe your organization or the thing that you're trying to push forward, there's some reason that it makes sense for you to be engaging politically. Or it might be very manipulative, and it might be making use of information that people gave you in one circumstance, not realizing that this information about how to contact them was actually going to be used for political means. And so that is a really problematic gray zone. It could be a registered third party, or it could be somebody who's not registered as a third party. And if they're a registered third party, they're already signing on, and they're already saying, look, I'm here, I'm doing political stuff. If they're not signing on, how do we know who they are, how they exist? Then we require people to maybe report. That requires the general public to know what is and is not a reasonable use of their information. And if we, the super politically engaged, don't really know what that is, I don't think we can expect the average citizen to be able to know either. And so we create this system where we don't have clear lines to ensure the transparency and accountability that we would need for Canadians doing that kind of broadcast role or even narrowcast role, because the system that we have, regulatory system we have, just isn't designed for it.
And we have to appreciate just how many people are turning to social media as the first source for news and information. Either, so CBC News, for example, our largest referral traffic comes from Facebook. So huge amounts of news consumption is happening in those spaces, and exclusively in those spaces.
I'd like to push back on this just a little bit, because even when information flows through Facebook and Twitter and Reddit, these are consistently rated the least trustworthy of sources. So I would say the fact that they end up on your site at all is a really good sign, right? The fact that it's not just flowing through the news feed and not clicking on things, the fact that they're clicking,
they're opting in.
They're opting in. That is a really, really good sign. I think that that's a very helpful indicator that digital and media literacy can be useful tools here in terms of equipping the population with knowledge that going and clicking through things is helpful. Going and finding alternative sources. Don't just take the first search result. Take a couple and then form your opinion. That evidence is helpful, I think, for us in thinking about ways that we can build out a stronger citizen response to this changed environment.
So we're very focused at Policy Options on solutions. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do. Taylor, a lot of this centers around data. if you're all familiar with the Cambridge Analytica affair and how data of millions of people was used without their knowledge, it's very much central, I think, to all these conversations. But so what can we do to safeguard the data that make sure that they have control over their own data? Is that a possible thing to achieve through policy, public policy?
Absolutely. We're not doing it, but we could. The challenge with the policy prescriptions in this whole space is that these digital technologies affect so much of our economy and our lives that there isn't one regulatory move or one legal change or one new data rights policy that will actually change the structure of this digital economy we've created and the incentives within it. So any government in the world that's looked at this seriously, and there are now a number that have all come to the almost identical conclusion, which is the only way of getting at this problem we've been talking about is a pretty comprehensive package of policies that include new data rights regimes that put the control over data in individuals, have much higher degree, more clear forms of consent of what we're opting into, and really change the fundamentals of how data can flow internationally and how it can be used and commoditized by private companies, right? So the data is an important piece of it. But on its own, that is insufficient to this problem. We also need new competition policy, because part of the core challenge we've seen here is that we've allowed 4 or 5 companies to essentially become private global monopolies, controlling our data and controlling the information we receive. And we know that publicly traded monopolies do not self-regulate. So there needs to be pushback on the structure of those companies. And finally, the trickiest of all of them is policies around content itself. What are we going to allow as a society, as a democratic society, to be said and amplified and circulated by private organizations? Are we going to start to impose some greater restrictions on what can and can't be said, what can and can't be amplified? And you're seeing it's the most difficult because it touches clearly on issues around free speech, yes, and around the control of what is ultimately done by private organizations in our society. But we need to do all of those things together if we're really getting at this problem.
How would you characterize where we are in Canada in terms of that policymaking, thinking and process? Now, the two of you are amongst the leading voices in the academic community in this area, and it's a fairly small community so far. What about on the side of the policymakers? I mean,
I'll let Elizabeth comment too. My feeling is that we're in a radically different place than we were a year ago. And much further than 2 years. 2 years ago, even talking about this as an important or critical policy area was not even on the radar. And now you have, I think, a serious effort by the federal government in particular to engage with this set of problems. But it's complicated because it's 20 policies that have to be implemented by different departments and have to be coordinated together, both amongst jurisdictions in Canada and internationally. So we're at the beginning of that process. But Elizabeth's been involved with it too. So.
Yeah, I would largely agree. I think the conversations that at least I've been privy to and that I've heard about are much farther ahead than we were a year, 2 years ago. I think that they are at the similar level to other jurisdictions internationally, which is great. But at the same time, it took way too long to get an elections law update on the books. It took way too long to get something that is insufficient. And so when we think about what is actually going to happen moving forward, when we've got this very complex set of policies that are going to need to be put together and agreed upon, I still am concerned.
Sorry, go on.
Just one quick point on that. The countries that have moved the fastest have had a clear crisis. So the UK had Brexit. New Zealand had Christchurch. Those two events were catalyzing in the policy community to get at the kinds of range of things we're talking about. And I don't think we've had that crisis here. So we're at a slightly different stage.
Thankfully.
Absolutely, thankfully. But we know those crises can make governments move in a way they don't over long deliberative processes.
So there's policies in the journalism community too.
Yes, for sure. And we're part of the Google Trust project, and that is best practices in terms of media. I think transparency is a theme for everybody. Working together to put a focus on this kind of area in terms of coverage. We're doing it, but we can work collaboratively with other news organizations in different ways. We're putting out a fake news Bible, making sure the tools to help people understand some of the things they can do to understand where their information is coming from, which will be part of our election campaign. And then more and more effort in terms of helping the public become active in terms of understanding this as an issue.
Sure. So a lot of the attempts seem to make the public not trust CBC or the Globe or policy options, or so that you don't actually know what information is reputable and what's not.
That's
so
right.
What are you doing internally so that people know, okay, this is some news I can trust? And I know you're always going to get the people that say mainstream media, it's BS and don't read it, but
So we're doing different things. One, we are monitoring social media, and we're trying to understand campaigns and themes that have been amplified. We're reporting on it. We've launched a project around sort of labeling information. One of the things we haven't talked about, but I have research that shows even in our own sort of space, labeling content as sponsored content or news content isn't enough to really separate it in the context of the minds of the consumer. So we're looking at that, how we delineate journalism content out more deliberately. We're working with experts in the intelligence community and obviously with academics to help us understand things that we need to pay attention to or understand what trends are coming through. And then we're spending money on these units that will have a focal point on discovering and exposing disinformation or the verification of fact in the context of the elections, but in other areas as well. So I think those are the things we can do. But I think for the media, in terms of changing their own sort of practices, I think transparency is a theme. I think
what does that look like in terms of maybe you can describe labeling?
So we're looking in terms of our digital product of not only saying this is a fact, but unpacking why we come to the conclusion that it's a fact, and unpacking things in a more deliberate way. Talk about our choices and why we make them, or what we know and what we don't know, and how we write stories more deliberately, and then coming in more often with editors' blogs or notes to give people the context behind what they're seeing in terms of the stories.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Jennifer. That was a great conversation. Let's give them a warm
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you all for being here today, and also thank you to those of you who came to all 4 of our events. It's been really fun to host these and have these great conversations. We hope to have some more. We have your emails, so we'll send you information. Thank you to the Max Bell School of Public Policy, which partnered with us on this whole series of events, and also to the CBC and to Microsoft for being a sponsor of this particular event. So, and also I wanted to thank my colleagues, Suzanne Lambert and Shirley Cardenas, who have been the workforce behind all of these events. It's a lot of setup and a lot of details and organization. So thank you to my colleagues, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.